I'm Richard Ward. I'm still fairly new on the faculty here at Phillips. I came last June as the Fred Craddock Chair in Homiletics and Worship, and I'm happy to collaborate with Susanna in this particular course. I love the idea of the course. And when I was at ILIF, which was where I was just before coming to Phillips, we had a similar group that was called supervised ministry. You all have supervised ministry, but it's a different rubric, but the idea is the same. And we took turns in our group bringing a religious resource. That was what we called it, a religious resource, because some people in the group were parts of different faiths. And so every week we were treated to someone bringing in a resource that meant a lot to them personally. And so that's what I consider this being, a resource that I have used in my own spiritual practice, or a way of going about my spiritual practice, my devotional practice. Among many, this is not the only way I do it. And it includes some material that's deeply personal to me. So I'm going to offer that to you as for your own reflection, for your own resource. So the first thing I want to do is, I like the image that Barbara Taylor begins her book, The Assigned Reading, Preaching Life. I like the image of the church in Turkey. It's from the Republic of Georgia. And I'm not sure why I like it, because it's a disturbing image to me. And the image is this: she is on some kind of pilgrimage, as I recall, some kind of trip, and her guide takes her back into this overgrown area along with some others. And they discover there a church. It's a kind of reversal of the old hymn, Church in the Wildwood. Some of you may know that from country gospel. It's a reversal of that, because the Church in the Wildwood is a pleasant, nostalgic image. It speaks of a time, oh, come to the church in the wildwood, a simpler time, a time where there was more confidence in faith and so on. And by contrast, this church that Barbara describes in Preaching Life serves as a kind of overture for her whole book. And that is, it's a graphic depiction of living in a post-Christian era. I love the imagery, but I'm also disturbed by the image of a church where Christianity has died in modern Turkey. And the book that she writes is kind of a theme for this devotional, if you will, my religious resource. It's in the face of that, and with such a graphic depiction of the decay of a particular church in a particular setting. How do we live in spite of? How do we live in a kind of resistance while embracing what we believe and what we know in our own experience, when the culture has seemingly passed us by? Barbara has the extended reflection on that in her book. We'll talk about some specifics about that later, about why I recommended it, what I find in it that's relevant to preaching. But I began to think of where that particular image would take me. What parts of my story did it wake up? And I think that is, in fact, how in my life and in my spiritual practice, how God uses the materials of our memory and our imagination. And since Barbara is a personal friend of mine, there is that sense of this is a gift of a friend for our reflection. And I went to a place where I used to go when I was about 17, 18 years old, and first learning how to play the guitar. This was one of the first songs that I learned. And I learned it because I saw the singer of the song in concert, and he sang it. It's Noel Paul Stookey. I was a big fan of Peter, Paul, and Mary, still am. God rest Mary's soul. But Paul Stookey had a solo piece of this concert, and he came out, and I was in a very difficult time in my life, 17, 18, getting ready to go to college, wondering what it was all, feeling some call to ministry, but it was all very complicated and strange. And Paul Stookey came onto the stage, and he sang this song, and it became a real marker for me in my life. And I think it also picks up on the theme of living in spite of what we see around us as decline and decay. It's called Hymn. Sunday morning, very bright, I read your book by colored light that came in through the pretty window picture. I visited some houses where they said that you were living, and they talked a lot about you, and they spoke about your giving. They passed a basket with some envelopes. I just had time to write a note. All it said was, I believe in you. Passing conversations where they mentioned your existence and the fact that you had been replaced by your assistants. The discussion was theology, and when they smiled and turned to me, all that I could say was, I believe in you. I visited your house again on Christmas and Thanksgiving, and a balded man said you were dead, but your house would go on living. He recited poetry, and when he saw me stand to leave, he shook his head and said, I'd never find you. My mother used to dress me up, and while my dad was sleeping, we would walk down to your house without speaking. That was Hymn by Paul Stookey. When I got to college, one of the best classes that I had was a Sunday school class. Yep, I went to Sunday school in college. I went to Oklahoma Baptist University, in fact, and many people excused themselves from having a church life because they thought, well, I'm in a Baptist school, that should count. But I went to the University Baptist Church in Shawnee, Oklahoma. And my Sunday school teacher was the science teacher. A gruff, Santa Claus-y, it's like Santa Claus in a bad mood. It was how we understood Dr. Hurley. He was passionate about everything he taught, and he taught faith, the Christian faith. He had pretty strict rules. He conducted Sunday school class like a seminar, and we were expected to be prepared when we would come on Sunday morning for our regular seminar, for our class. On Saturdays, later I came to call him Jim, but it was a great effort because I went on the faculty with Jim, but for a long time it was Dr. Hurley. Dr. Hurley would come into the dorm. This was an all, well, it was male and female, but he couldn't go into the women's dorm, but he came into the men's dorm, and he would slide the articles under our door that we were to read. And it was the first time I ever heard of people like Karl Barth, Emil Brunner, Bultmann, the Niebers. The first time I ever heard of a place called Rockefeller Chapel at the University of Chicago, or the Riverside Church, where William Sloane Coffin was preaching. We read sermons by Carl Marney, who is a favorite Baptist minister of ours, who was a maverick and a wonderful preacher, prophetic preacher. And we would go to the class, and we were expected to have read the articles and to discuss them. But there was one final session where no articles came, and there was no reading done. And we wondered if something was wrong because there was no article under the door, or in the women's dorm they would find them in their boxes, their mailboxes. And so we wondered if we were having class. And we were having class. And we came to class and we said, what gives? We don't feel prepared. What's the topic for today? We were somewhat nervous. He'd get mad at us for not, I didn't get the article, so on. He said, there is no article today. There is no reading today. We're going to talk about what each of you affirms. Well, what do you mean? What do we affirm? What do we affirm? That's just it. We're going to go around the seminar, and each of you will make a statement about what do you affirm. So these two things, all that I could say was, I believe in you. And that event of going around the circle saying, what do you affirm, and answering that question brought to mind Karl Barth when they said, how would you summarize your theology? The great theologian Karl Barth. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And I thought of Jesus' words, unless you become as a little child, you will not see the realm of God. So my hope is that you will have in your seminary life regular trips back to something like that seminar in your mind, in your imagination, or perhaps in reality here at Phillips. And you will always come back after all that you've read and what you've sung and all that you've worshiped and all that you've even preached. You'll always come back to that question. It's probably one of the most important questions in ministry. What do you affirm?